Good afternoon, ladies. Today we're going to continue our study of the ancient African civilizations, and we're going to be talking about the civilization of Zimbabwe. So, Zimbabwe is located in southern Africa, between the Zambezi and the Limpopo River. And that's this area here. From the larger map, you can see on our inset map the Zambezi River, the Popo River here. And this civilization thrived from 700 CE to about 1450 CE. Now, remember, we can't be exactly sure when civilizations end because it's not a sudden end, it's a gradual end. As their economy starts to fall apart, as people start to move away, or as enemies attack, then that's when their civilization begins to fall apart. So, the Zimbabwe kingdom encompasses most of what is modern day Zimbabwe, which you can see here. And it's a society that was based on farming and trading. Cattle were very important in this area as well because there's a lot of grassland and plenty of water for cattle in that area. But they also made their money trading. They were situated in a prime spot to trade with the folks along the east coast of Africa, the Swahili people that lived along the coast here, those people of the Mediterranean because they could travel through the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, the Arabian Peninsula here, and even people further east in India. So they were in this prime position because they could trade for these goods from this part of the world, Eastern, but they also could trade with Western part of Africa, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Uh, Zim- the Great Zimbabwe also had a great amount of gold in its vicinity, and they were able to trade with gold with West Africa, ivory with West Africa, and with Asia. It was also Great Zimbabwe is the city that was the power seat of power, and it was home of the monarch. Now we all know that a monarch is a king, or in this case, it is a king. And the monarchs lived in Great Zimbabwe, and we're going to take a look at what their living quarters or living town would have looked like. So Great Zimbabwe was male dominated society, meaning that the males of the family controlled everything that went on in society. Women, as in most ancient civilizations in other parts of the world, not so much in Africa, because in many parts of Africa, women were as much in power as men were, but in a lot of European settlements and other Asian settlements, women tended to crops, harvested the crops, fetched the water, and cooked the meals. The men who were unmarried would also have jobs, and they would tend to not tend to, but they would they did tend to cattle, but they also went out and did hunting for game. Game as the wild animals, as we know, and they would be hunting for elephants. They would be hunting for zebra or any other meats. They would also be scouting out for places where they could get gold. They tended to trade a lot for gold and with ivory as well. So, how did someone become powerful in Zimbabwe civilization? And that was through the number of cattle they owned. Cattle was a rich man's animal in this time, and there is evidence from our historical and archaeological digs that only the wealthiest ate the cattle. The poor did not eat the cattle in Zimbabwe. Most likely, if they owned cattle, they used them for subsistence, meaning that they used them for their milk. They used them for their service as pack animals to move goods and things like that, to pull trees and plows and things. So, if you had cattle or if you owned property, you would have power, prestige. The most wealthiest of these people were the chief. The chief we also would call the king. But Zimbabwe, historians have not found any evidence that Zimbabwe had any type of military force or anything of such. So the chief had to work to compromise. And a compromise, think about that for a moment. So a compromise is coming to an agreement to do something, or where each party has to give a little, take a little. from that. So the chief, in order for him to remain in power, or as the king to remain in power, he had to compromise with the other wealthy members of the society. But as I said, there was no evidence of any violent overthrow of government or anything like that. So historians haven't found anything like that. Stone monuments, these stone walls, were a symbol of authority and prestige, as we said, but historians aren't clear as to their purpose because while they may have been a symbol of authority, they defy logic. They were built and they have withstood for thousands of years, hundreds of years, I should say, hundreds of years, and there is no mortar holding them together. There's no cement between them or anything like that. They are just stacked intricately on top of one another and they hold together. And they still remain today. You can still go to Zimbabwe and see these ruins today. So Zimbabwe did a lot of trade with Asia, with the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. Uh, so they were positioned in this part of Africa that made them very well suited to be the controllers of trade. They exported gold and other resources. That other resources would have been ivory, primarily, maybe some cattle, but mostly ivory and gold. And they would transport these long distances to Asia, to the Middle East, and along the east coast of Africa, as we've mentioned. As archaeologists and historians have been studying Great Zimbabwe, the city in Zimbabwe, they have found some artifacts. They have found glass beads. Glass beads would have came from the Middle East and the Europe. They found cloth, remnants of cloth, which would have come from China and India. But the most interesting things they found were these vases, made of Chinese celadon, which is this green material here. It's like a ceramic, and porcelain, which is a very fine glass product. This blue and white is a very common Chinese uh, theme that you see on a lot of porcelain. You may have seen this in your grandmother's china cabinet or something like that or at an antique store or somewhere. It's a very common pattern. A lot of modern day dishes are made of regular glass, not porcelain, not the fine porcelain from China, but you can still see this even today in 2020. So as we leave Zimbabwe, we're going to head to our next civilization. Our next civilization is the Empire of Ghana. In this slideshow, there is a video. It's about 15 minutes long, so I'm not going to show it now. But you can watch this video on the Empire of Ghana if you're reviewing it. You just simply go to the slide deck and click on the picture here, and it will take you to the video to watch it. In this video, there are some guided notes from the teacher who created it, Mr. Klein. You do not have to complete those guided notes. You can follow along with him talking and see the images, but you do not have to complete the guided notes in there. So what about Ghana? Well, Ghana began around 100 CE. Remember, CE is the common era. It's time measurement that we use. It roughly corresponds with the adjustment of counting time around the time of the birth of Christ. So you may hear it referred to as AD, but the more appropriate term that we use as historians use now is CE. The empire lasted to about 1200 CE, but it wasn't as rich and didn't thrive as much until the later part of its civilization, around 800 to 1100 CE. And that's when the kings, the Ghanans, or the Ghanas of Ghana, began to really amass wealth. And we'll talk about how they did that in just a little bit. So Ghana is located in West Africa, and it has a very complex society. Now, we define societies or civilizations in many ways around their religion, around their economy, around their government, around their culture. And culture will include things like their writing system. Well, Ghana did not have its own form of writing. They were a very intelligent society. They did read, but they read Muslim texts, the Quran mostly, and things written by Muslim scholars. But they didn't have their own form of writing or their own form of language. But they did have a division of labor. There were those who were wealthy, the nobles, there were the merchants, and then there were the laborers. And they also did enslave their enemy tribes. If they conquered them, they enslaved them. There was wealth in Ghana. As a matter of fact, they amassed a lot of wealth through a system of taxation, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. But their biggest thing that they did was they traded. And they traded because they needed something that wasn't available in West Africa. It was a necessary nutrient that everyone needs even today, and that was salt. Ghana needed salt. Now, where did they find the salt? In the Muslim with the Muslim merchants that lived in East Africa on the Arabian Peninsula. But Ghana needed something to trade in order to get that salt. Ghana experienced its wealth because there was an enormous amount of gold in West Africa. So the Ghana people of Ghana, the residents of Ghana, would mine the gold, and they would trade that gold with Muslim traders from East Africa and from the Middle East. Now, not all the trading partners were Muslim, some were Christian, but Ghana converted to Islam because the king found out, if we are the same religion as the people we're trading with, we get a better deal. And because most of their traders were Muslim, that's why Muslim became the primary religion in that area. So the Ghana Empire grew rich from this trans-Saharan trade. Remember, the Sahara is the large desert that is in North Africa. It covers a third of the continent. Now, Ghana's king was known as the Ghana, hence the name, but he was also the war chief. And he did a lot of ensuring that he captured his enemies and expanded the empire over time. Now, there was a series of these Ghanans or these kings that did that. It wasn't just a single one, there was a series of them that did that. This king served as their commander in chief, meaning he was in charge of the army, and it was a highly organized army. He controlled all trade activities. As a matter of fact, he set up a system of taxation. This system of taxation required that if you were a gold miner, you mined gold, the larger nuggets, the big rocks of gold, had to go to the king. The little flakes, the dust of gold that they got, they could keep. The person who was mining the gold could keep, and that's how those merchants were able to trade. Um, Also, he was the head administrator of justice. So he decided punishments, he decided uh, what was a crime, what was not a crime. Today, we would think of the administrator of justice as a judge. Each day, he would have court. The people would come before him, they would plead their case, and then he would decide their punishment, or if they were guilty or not, and then secondly, their punishment. As I mentioned earlier, Islam was introduced by the Muslim merchants because the people of Ghana, the merchants of Ghana, found that they would get better trade deals if they had or practiced the same religion as the person they were trading with. And the king collected lots of taxes from the gold salt trade. And we're going to talk about how he did that. One, as I mentioned, he would take the large gold nuggets from the miners of the gold, but he also did something else that was very important. And that's on the next slide we talked about. Of course, as we mentioned, Ghana controlled these trade routes across the Sahara. So from Gal to Cairo, from Timbuktu to Tripoli to Tunis to Gahaza, Kumbai, all these trade routes here at the time Ghana controlled. As they got larger and larger, they would control these routes. Now, as other empires came in and took over Ghana, particularly Mali and then Songhai, the trade routes would transfer to them. But at one time, Ghana controlled them all. So they would trade gold and ivory and slaves. Yes, as I mentioned, they enslaved their enemies. So they would trade them for salt from the Arabs. And the Arabs were the ones who lived along this east coast, northeast, this North African coast, and this peninsula here. Those were the Arabs. But they also would trade with the North Africans, those that lived up here in Fez, Tunis, Tripoli, and the Europeans further north, for horses, for cloth, for swords, and for books. Uh, so, they had a wide variety of things they traded for. One of the things that helped the trade network across the Sahara expand was the use of camels. Now, no, camels do not store water in their humps on their back. That is a myth. That is not true. But camels are very good at conserving water, and so they could make this trip along the Sahara or across the Sahara easier on the merchants. As they moved across this trade network, there was a very well defined path because you would have to go to oasis to oasis to oasis along this trail. And the oasis is where they would be able to get water, and that's why the oasis were most important. The merchants traveled in caravans, which were large groups of animals and people that made the journeys. You did not make this journey on your own or with just a few. You went with large numbers. Some of the caravans were estimated to have 2 to 3,000 people in them. Now, how did Ghana become so wealthy in this time? Well, Ghana was not the most wealthy of the empires we're going to be talking about lately or here soon, but they were very wealthy. And that was because the king came up with this double taxation system. So when goods came into Ghana, so if they were bringing goods from Cairo, if they were bringing goods from Tripoli, if they're bringing goods from Tunis, from Europe, from anywhere else, they were taxed when they came into the kingdom of Ghana. So they had to pay a tax. So that was the first tax that was paid. The merchants would come in, they would do their trading, they go about their business, they would get their gold, they would get their ivory, they would get whatever it is they want. They would get their enslaved people from Africa, from the Ghana. And then before they left, they would have to pay another tax on the goods that they were getting ready to take out of or export from Ghana. So this system of double taxation. You were taxed when you brought things in, you were taxed when you took things out. So that's how Ghana amassed wealth, is through this double taxation system. Okay, so that is Zimbabwe and Ghana. Remember, you do have a guided reading for each of those that is in your Google Classroom. So remember, you go to your Google Classroom. By getting there, you open a new tab. You click on your waffle, which you can't really see my waffle because of my screensaver or background. Click on the waffle, click on Classroom, and go to your classroom. When you're in that classroom, you'll click on your classwork tab. Look at week 12. Week 12 is where you will find your Great Zimbabwe reading, assignment number 26, and your Ghana reading, assignment number 27. And you'll need to make sure that you complete both of those as well. Here is a video for the Great Zimbabwe. You will need to start it at 15:30 through 25:25 for that video, and I'll have the videos posted they'll have the slide deck posted so that you can go and watch the video on Mali. If you have any questions, make sure you contact me through Google Classroom. You can do that when you're in the assignment. So if we open up the assignment here, you can type a private message here. which will go to the whole class. But if you're in the actual assignment, you can type it directly to me. This question goes to the whole class. And actually, let me take that back. I don't think you can do that. I think I have that limited just to me. So, all right. Again, that was Ghana and Mali. If you have any questions, get back to me. Or, I'm sorry, Zimbabwe and Ghana. That was Zimbabwe and Ghana. So if you have any questions, get back with me. And if not, have a great weekend, and I will talk to you on Monday.